Hello, beautiful people, and welcome, to a video on the Constellation Selector. I've already talked about the Constellation Selector, but with the new changes to all the Hex and Circle characters, a lot has changed. So I want to talk about both characters that are directly in the Hex and Circle that you can choose from the Constellation Selector, but also characters that aren't in the Hex and Circle, but that are getting indirectly buffed from either the Hex and Circle buffs or from Durin coming out. So first, let's mention the characters that got directly buffed from the Hex and Circle. All right, we got Albedo, Klee, Mona. Let's start with Klee because I think while it's not the simplest changes, it's the changes that are kind of the simplest to evaluate. What they did with Klee, as a reminder, or for those of you that haven't watched my video on the Hex and Circle changes, mainly, instead of only having one spark, she can charge up to 3 at the same time. So if you get lucky on your spark generation, instead of like the second spark just not doing anything, because you can't stack more than one, it now gets stocked for later. So she'll more reliably be able to get the explosive sparks on her charge attacks. She'll get more of them. The rest is witch only buffs. So they made it so that if you have 2 Hex and Circle related characters on the team, you get an additional buff. So for Klee, that buff is during her burst, her normal attack string doesn't reset anymore. So if you N1 and then dash, your next attack will be the N2, not the N1 again. And when she does her third normal attack, you get a coordinated charge attack, basically. On top of that, her charge attacks are now having their damage increased by 1.5 times. So they're like omega buffing the amount of damage that Klee's charge attacks can do and the amount of charge attacks she can do as well. I'm not entirely sure what her best combos are going to be, but it's probably going to be some form of like normal attacks into charge attacks into finishing the normal attack string, so you get the extra coordinated charge attack from finishing your string. But it looks like Klee got a pretty major buff to the point where like post buff C0 Klee, well optimized Klee combos look like they're going to be a tiny bit below Arlecchino, and poorly optimized Klee combos will be a decent amount below. But well, she's available from the Selector, and this is a video about the Selector. So if you get her C1, you get more hits from the C1 itself, but the C1 also got buffed to also give Klee 60% attack. And with the C1, I'd say that Klee's just raw damage output is actually slightly higher than Arlecchino's. Obviously, that doesn't necessarily mean that Klee is going to be better than Arlecchino. One, there's the combo optimization, and if you've ever played Klee, you'll know that it doesn't tend to be a particularly pleasant experience, at least until you get used to the combos. But also, Klee's like damage distribution and like hit distribution doesn't really allow her to be used in melt or vape reactions effectively. It feels awful and is going to get even worse with the changes because she's getting even more hits. So you're not going to be vaping or melting on her, really. She's pretty much exclusively for Monopyro or Shower's teams. But in those teams, if you're doing good combos, Klee will actually be a pretty solid character now. That being said, a certain amount of that is assuming that you will be able to do the combos that I've been looking at, and I don't know for a fact that they're possible. All that being said, if you have Klee, you like Klee, she's a character you like playing, she actually has a pretty okay C1 now. Klee's C1 is effectively pretty similar to a modern C1 in terms of increase to her personal damage. That being said, in pretty much all of her teams, she's not like the only source of team DPS, so it won't be as good for her team DPS as, for example, Nefer's C1 is for her teams. But the point I'm getting at here is Klee is going to be a pretty okay character with these buffs, assuming they go through as is. And if she's a character you like, her C1 is actually a good C1 to get. If you like Klee, I'd say she's arguably one of the, if not the best Constellation 1 to get from the Constellation Selector. I'd say it does more than Hu Tao's C1 does for her. Next is Albedo. With the buffs that he receives, Albedo is actually going to be a part of many characters' best teams. Now, he's not like insane, right? Most of those characters that have a great team with Albedo, they have an alternative that isn't that much worse, but he's pretty solid. The one thing though is that while his buffs are very, very significant, they're basically doubling his damage and giving him a team-wide buff. The buff to the C1 is pathetic. He just gains 50% defense. The way that defense is balanced, sources of defense generally give you more defense than sources of attack do. A defense sense is 58.3, an attack sense is 46.6. So this is basically the equivalent of about 40% attack on an attack scaler. And while that's not bad, Albedo's never the main source of damage on your team. He's just always a nice source of damage. And an increase to his personal damage that ranges between 10 and 15% generally leads to like 3 to 5% team DPS, which is, well, obviously a lot less than getting a constellation for a carry or a support constellation that increases the quantity of a buff. Overall, I'd say that Albedo C1 is not very good. It's not really something I'd recommend. The energy generation effect can be nice, but it doesn't tend to be all that impactful. If you already have C1 for some reason and you're like wondering how good the C2 is, the way that his C2 works now is it basically allows him to not use burst. His C2 used to be that it makes the burst scale with defense, but the scaling on defense was awful, so you didn't really care. It still has the old effect, but it now has a new effect, which says that when Albedo is off field and you get full stacks of the C2 effect, which is whenever your skill deals damage, you get a stack, and your burst deals more damage based on the amount of stacks you have. When he gets 4 stacks of this effect, he loses them, and he basically uses his burst from off field without having to swap into him. It doesn't do quite the full damage that the burst would do, but it does 900% of his defense as motion value, which is the equivalent of about 2 hits of his skill. And it happens every 4 hits of his skill, which means you're increasing your skill damage by about 50%. A bit less than that because I'm rounding up a little. But honestly, the best part of this, I mean, sure, the fact that you're just getting almost 50% more personal damage from Albedo is a pretty big deal. But something that's almost as important is you're now also getting the elemental mastery bonus from using burst without having to use burst and with full uptime. Right now with Albedo, having to use his burst kind of sucks because his burst doesn't do a lot of damage. You don't want to have to build ER, and the EM buff from using burst is only 10 seconds uptime. With a C2, you refresh that buff every 4 hits of your skill, which is generally less than every 10 seconds. So you have full uptime on the EM buff, and you don't have to use the burst at all because you get it just from the skill triggers. Albedo's C2 is definitely a really good one. So if you somehow got his C1, and I realize that there's like 3 people watching this are at C1 Albedo, no more, no less. But if that's you, if you're one of those 3 people, Albedo's probably your best choice from this selector. Does that mean that it's worth pulling for Albedo and his C1 to get this C2? No, don't get baited by that. This is just for people that already have C1 Albedo. Last of the 3 characters that is directly getting buffed here is Mona. Mona's constellations are getting buffed. Mona as a whole is getting buffed. Unlike the other 2, Mona is a standard character, so everyone either has her or can get her from a selector or might get her from losing a 50-50. And then on top of that, you can get her constellations from the selector, but you might also already have a bunch of constellations on her. So her constellations past C1 also matter quite a bit more. Here are the buffs that Mona got. The default C0 buff was only to the witch stuff, so if you have 2 witches on your team, and it is that after using Mona's burst, you can stay on the field for a little bit longer and do some normal attacks on Mona, and if you do, it extends her burst duration. Instead of lasting for 5 seconds, you can make the burst last for up to 13 seconds, because it's plus 2 seconds per normal attack, and you can do 4. They also gave her an effect that increases the vape damage of your team when she does normal attacks to like incentivize on-fielding Mona with off-field pyro damage dealers. But the main thing they're doing here is the Omen uptime extension. The thing is, there's a few of Mona's constellations that directly buff what the Omen does, which means that buffing the duration of the Omen also buffs the value of those constellations. So let's talk about them. The C1 is getting a small buff. It does the same thing that it used to, but the 15% numbers for the increase to Hydra reactions goes up to 24% if your characters are off field. This is the smallest one of the buffs. C2 is the first pretty big one. Initially, her C2, when a normal attack hits, there's a 20% chance that it will be automatically followed by a charge attack with a 5-second cooldown. That's what it used to do. Now, they added 2 effects. 1, the first normal attack that she does after burst is guaranteed to proc this effect. And 2, when her charge attacks hit opponents, she buffs the team's EM by 80. That's a pretty big deal, especially because you want to do a few normal attacks after her burst in order to extend the Omen now. You pretty much always just get this. That's pretty cool. The C2 is now also a pretty solid support constellation, not just a stupid personal damage constellation that doesn't do anything. Next, C4. The biggest change to the C4 is just the Omen duration extension. Instead of lasting 5 seconds, it can last 13, which is massive because it basically means that your 30% CV is lasting for most of your uptime instead of just like a third of it. But also, they're adding 15 crit damage for Hexen Circle characters. So witches get a little bit more from her C4, and it's 45 CD instead of 30. And finally, her C6. Right now, her C6 gives her damage percent when she's staying in her alternate sprint for multiple seconds. It's really bad because you don't want to stay on your alternate sprint, like, ever. Well, the new C6 can also give you this effect from being next to an enemy affected by Omen, which means you just get this for free. You don't have to enter alternate dash, so you can actually play Mona as a carry. Also, because that wasn't enough, the C6 now also doubles her charge attack damage. So the C6 turns Mona into a pretty solid carry. I'd say that compared to Molani, who's another like forward vape carry, C6 Mona is a fairly similar character in terms of damage output, but a bit more cringe to play because you got stamina to deal with, and Mona's targeting is pretty awful. That being said, honestly, Molani's also getting buffed from all of this shit. Both Molani with Mona and Molani with Albedo are getting some pretty massive buffs. Molani is gonna get a lot stronger from these witch buffs. So I'm not too sure about C6 Mona as a carry. I'd say that the main important changes are the changes to C1, 2, and 4. And so the question remains, should you select Mona? Well, on one hand, selecting Mona means you're not selecting someone else. And if you are patient and willing to just select Mona from the standard selector in the next few years, you can get her to C6 without ever having to select her here. On the other hand, her constellations are useful on some actual meta teams now, right? There's going to be Molani that I've already mentioned, but there's also a lot more. There's going to be Durin carry teams that are pretty heavily reliant on Mona having constellations if you want to do Durin Mona. And there's a bunch of other characters that will now be able to use Mona for their reactions. All in all, I'd say that if you're at C0 Mona, the C1, like it's all right. The C2 is all right. I think the big constellation is the C4 more so than the other two. But I'd say that overall, Mona is a pretty good character to select, right? If you ever end up with more than C6 Mona eventually, you're not unhappy about that because you now get the Masterless Stella Fortuna out of it. That's it for the characters that got directly buffed. Now for characters that got indirectly buffed from their teams becoming better. Wanderer got buffed from Durin, from Venti, but honestly, the buff wasn't that big. At this point, Wanderer's barely better than using like Cinder City Aoife if you're going to be doing the Venti Durin core. So I don't think it's really affected his value in the Constellation Selector all that much, but I did want to mention him quickly. Ito's C1 sucks ass. If you want to improve your Ito team, just get Albedo's C1. Yoimiya is getting some much stronger teams with Durin, but her C1 is still complete dog shit, so you don't really care, unfortunately. Sino. You know, I haven't looked at Sino Durin stuff too much yet. Xiao also is getting, just like Wanderer, some much better teams. Xiao is a better character than Wanderer, so the gap between him and just Cinder City Aoife is a little bit bigger, almost to the point where it feels worthwhile, but his C1 is still pretty dog shit, so you don't really care too much. Characters like Yai that you will be able to use in like overload Durin teams got a bit better. But honestly, the buffs to Razor are so big that it makes me very critical of electro carries that are worse than he is now. And playing Yai as a carry in an overload team is kind of that at this point. Ayato can have some interesting things with Burgeon Durin things, but his C1 is also pretty bad. Honestly, this is a problem that a lot of these characters share, is that their C1 is not all that good. So even if they get better from the Hexen Circle changes, you're better off going for a Constellation on the Hexen Circle character you're using, whether it be Mona, Klee, or Albedo. Yeah, that's pretty much it. Honestly, initially, I thought, before the changes were announced, my thoughts were that the best constellations to get were like Shenhe's C1, Baiju's C1, Mona constellations, Hu Tao's C1, maybe Nilo's C1. Constellations that don't do too much, but at least were on characters that you could actually put on your team without feeling awful about it, right? None of those cons are that great, but at least you would use them. Now, I'd say that Mona's constellations in general kind of eclipse everything else. If you're playing Klee as a carry, there's that too. And then Albedo's C1 as like your default once you already have your Monacon, or if you don't need a Monacon. So that's gonna be it for this video. Hope you enjoyed, hope you learned a thing or two. And I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye, YouTube.